everyone. Thanks for listening to Wake Up, Look Up, a podcast where we connect events happening in real time to the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm Zach Wyrock, and this is a special episode that's looking at the recent assassination attempt on former President Trump. We felt like it's a significant enough of a news story that it required a special attempt to talk about it, especially from a gospel angle. It is the first assassination attempt on a president or former president in the last 40 years, and a sobering day for our country. So let's take a look at it, particularly from the lens of the gospel. There are a lot of things that I think are worth considering here. This episode will be a little different, maybe a little longer than normal, and maybe cover a little more ground than normal. Thanks for bearing with us. And the first thing I want to say is that when something like this happens, it penetrates a myth that we as Americans kind of buy into. It's called American Exceptionalism. Now, I want to state for the record, we live in a great country. I'm really glad to be an American, and we should be grateful to live in the country that we live in. But sometimes, because our country is so great, and because we are afforded the privileges and luxuries of its being so great, we buy into this idea that bad things don't really happen, shouldn't happen, can't happen in our country. Particularly things like this, political violence. We think of that as the kind of things we hear happening around the world, but would never actually take place here. They shock us when they happen because we have a default setting that would say that doesn't happen in America. The problem with something like American exceptionalism is it ignores the reality of the landscape of our country. We live in a great country, but we've been heading down this road for a while. The reality is that what happened Saturday in Butler, Pennsylvania, is an indictment on the political rhetoric that our country has been engaging in for some time. Politics has long stopped being about policy. In fact, most people running for office these days aren't even really putting policy proposals out there. Politics has become about demonizing the other side, about pointing at their character, pointing at them as dangerous, making campaigns about not just the downside of your opponent, but even apocalyptic versions of the future. If my opponent wins, it's the end of democracy. If my opponent wins, it's the end of our country. That language is not just heated, it's not just divisive, it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it awakens a kind of fear in us that will inevitably lead to destructive choices. And I want to say, by the way, for the record, that language exists on both sides. I mean, I was thinking about this morning on my drive here to the church to record, that if I had told someone who was away from the news recently that there had been an attempt on one of the candidates' lives, I think most people would have guessed it would have been an attempt on President Biden's life. That's because there's this idea out there that the Trump campaign and Trump supporters are inherently dangerous to our country, that it's their ideology, their actions that we most need to worry about. And yet it wasn't President Biden who was shot at. It was President Trump. It wasn't Trump supporters. It was obviously someone who had bought into the anti-Trump rhetoric. And that just reinforces the idea that there are violent things being said all the way around. Even in the video of the assassination attempt, which is sobering and scary, you can see people in the crowd wearing shirts that say, "Let's go Brandon," or expletive Biden. It's that very language that eventually leads here. Political rhetoric that is hateful turns into hate. And as history has taught us, hate almost always turns into violence. I think we all have to step back and realize that this is a little bit like an addict who's making bad choices right and left and then is shocked when the one final big choice destroys their lives. Meanwhile, everyone around them is saying, "Who hasn't seen this coming?" This is a little bit of a wake-up call for our sobriety from an angry kind of politics, a doomsday, apocalyptic kind of politics that will always inescapably lead to violence. And I want us to acknowledge that, because the truth is that the angry, violent things that are being said are not just being said outside the church in the larger world, but inside the church by Christians. We're as guilty of it as anybody. We all paint these doomsday scenarios if our candidate of choice doesn't win. And I know the pushback might be, well, listen, I can hold on to my political beliefs without becoming violent. And that's probably true for most of us. But it isn't just that your political beliefs and your political words or mine can lead to our violence. Other people are listening as well. It turns out that the would-be assassin was a 20-year-old kid. I don't think he derived his political ideas on his own. My guess is he didn't have a degree in political science and hadn't spent a ton of time paying attention to the news for the first 20 years of his life. My assumption is that someone, whether it's a family member, a friend, talk radio, YouTube, someone got in his ear, and their angry political rhetoric became his violent choices. Now, that's not excusing his actions, but it is saying he's not the only one complicit. We need to recognize that our kids are listening, people are listening, and we never really know when our political language intersects with someone who is mentally unstable, someone who has a penchant for violence, someone who will take it a little too far. This, of course, begs the question, will we learn? Will we learn? I was hopeful that in the wake of this would-be assassination, our country might have a wake-up call. And at first, you started to hear calls coming for unity, calls to lower the temperature, both by Republicans and Democrats. But those didn't last very long. There was a Democratic lawmaker in Colorado who said we shouldn't feel sympathy for the devil, meaning Trump. Our own Ohio Senator, J.D. Vance, instantly began blaming Joe Biden as saying his rhetoric is what led here. Personal attacks came almost instantaneously. The very kind of rhetoric that probably led us here in the first place. So maybe our country isn't going to learn. Maybe our politicians aren't going to learn, but that doesn't excuse you and I. Will we learn? Will we be more careful with what we say? Will we return to politics about policy, about things that are being proposed, about direction for our country legislatively, rather than making it about personal attacks and apocalyptic doomsday kind of thinking? It's a wake-up call for all of us, and we're all ultimately accountable for how we respond. All right, that's the political side. But let me shift to more the pastoral side and offer some thoughts for you and I as we deal just with the anxiety and the uncertainty that exists in our own hearts and minds in the wake of such a horrific event. The first thing I want to say is this assassination attempt was heinous, and I'm so glad that former President Trump's life wasn't lost. That would have been even more horrific, and I don't wish that on anyone. I am, however, concerned that you're already starting to hear, particularly from Christian circles, language about this event being proof that President Trump is God's anointed leader, that him turning his head at just the right time is proof positive that God has chosen him and that God is protecting him, ultimately leading him to the presidency. I don't know a better way of saying this. That's blasphemous. Speaking for God, things that he has not said for himself, is pretty much the definition of blasphemy. Not only that, it's a violation of the commandment to not take the Lord's name in vain. God has spoken in the scriptures. He has spoken in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are not entitled to speak for him, and we are not certainly entitled to attach his name to our political candidate. Again, I'm glad President Trump wasn't injured, but we should avoid any language that assigns God's plan or God's choice to him as a result of this. That's not a political statement. That's a theological statement. The Bible makes very clear that God takes that very seriously. The other thing that we should keep in mind is that James tells us that life is a vapor. It's here today and it's gone tomorrow. That's true for presidential candidates, even with Secret Service details, even with some of the best highly trained people protecting their lives. Still, life can be lost in a second. That should always be a wake-up call for us, to make sure that we're living lives that we are proud of, lives that are honoring to God, that we're telling the people that we love them, that we're being kind, that we're being generous. we can live with this idea that we'll make things right tomorrow, but tomorrow isn't promised, whether you're a presidential candidate or a regular person. I'll tell you another thing that I've been thinking about as a pastor of a church. Again, the would-be assassin was 20 years old. I was thinking about if that kid had grown up in Hudson. And I began to wonder if that had been true, if he grew up in Hudson, where I live, where our church is, would our student ministry have engaged him? Would he have come to a kids camp? Would he have been brought on a Sunday? I guess what I'm saying is this is why it's so vitally important that churches invest in the next generation, that we take seriously the need to reach kids, because we don't know the environments that they're growing up in. We don't know what's going on in their heads and in their hearts, and we don't know that troubled kid in the corner in our youth group isn't ultimately going to end up making destructive choices, not just for himself, but for other people. Reaching the next generation is vitally important. And if this event is a wake-up call for anything, it might just be a wake-up call for that in our churches. Reaching students and children matter. And I know I'll be taking a renewed interest in that here at CCC as a result of this event. And then finally, I want to honor one man who did lose his life as a result of these horrific incidents. His name's Corey Comparator. He's a firefighter that was at the Trump rally with his family. And when the first shots were fired by the would-be assassin, Corey did a heroic thing. And when every instinct of his body was probably telling him to take care of himself, he threw himself across his family to shield them from the gunfire. And ultimately, he did. He did shield them. He did save their lives at the cost of his own. What a challenge that is for me as a father, as heroism so often is. And what would I do in that situation? Am I ready to lay down my life for my family? Is my first instinct to think about others, those who are looking to me to take care of them or to take care of myself? Corey Comparator was a hero, and I'm sure it's something that his family will live with as his legacy, even as they miss him. And I just want to honor that legacy here. No surprise that a man whose professional career was built around running into situations that everybody else was running out of, that in that moment he would think more about other people than himself. There's a lot to learn here and a lot to unpack, and more will be coming out all the time, and we'll deal with it as it does. But right now, there are plenty of things for us to think about in the aftermath of this horrific event. Hey, thanks for watching this video. Make sure you hit like and subscribe to get future content from Wake Up Look Up and from Christ Community Chapel. And while you're here, check out the other videos we have available.